Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Durazno natural processed Guatemala from Langøra Kaffe. And there's the container right there. And Langøra, based out of Stjørdal, Norway. And this is part 23 of our 24-part KaffeBox Advent Calendar series, and our second coffee from Langøra in this Advent calendar. And they are one of the Scandinavian coffee roasters we have a little more familiarity with. And one thing we mentioned in our previous Langøra review is that they have started to skew a little more on the heavier experimental processed side of coffees. And as a result, they've had some really interesting coffees over the last couple of months. So I was very curious to see which coffee they would offer in this Advent calendar. And I'm not going to lie, I was a little disappointed to see it be a natural processed Guatemalan coffee, given that the natural processed Central and South American coffees have been some of my least favorite coffees over the last couple of years. But given that I really like Langøra, it's going to be interesting to see how this coffee turned out. And again, the way that this works, the notes and tasting are made with the V60. This cup right here is made with the Chemex, and Langøra does have a brew guide on their website, which roughly translates to a 16.67 to 1 water to coffee ratio. And they say just off boil, so we opted for slightly higher temperatures, 98 degrees Celsius. Now, in terms of roast profile for this coffee, as I mentioned a lot, it's a little bit more difficult to tell with natural processed coffees. This one does have a little bit of brightness, so that does indicate that there isn't too much development to the cup. However, you can definitely tell that it has a little bit more development than the super light coffees, so it's somewhere in the middle. We'll say a moderately light coffee by most standards. With that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. And first impression, and you can immediately tell that the most important thing was to gauge what sort of clarity we were going to experience from this cup. And right off the bat, it was very heavy, very heavily fermented, and so much of the robust, strong chocolate characteristics with very little clarity. So that answered the question almost immediately, and it was at this point that I kind of figured we're going to be in for what was essentially a rough drink for me, something that I don't necessarily enjoy, and something I always have difficulty really defining and articulating when it comes to coffee. It oftentimes just comes out very reminiscent of stout beer, and given that I can't really taste too much in beer, it's always a struggle to really pull out very specific defining characteristics of the cup. But what I came up with for this one was it is most defined by the robust kind of overbearing characteristics with a very long-lasting finish. That, of course, being the chocolatey aspect, the more fermenty aspect. And there were additional components found within this cup, and that includes the graininess, which is funny because yesterday I was mentioning how it lacked the graininess that I experienced from a lot of natural processed coffees, yet we came back one day later and I was able to experience that in this coffee. In addition to the olive-like aspect that I oftentimes also experience with both anaerobics as well as natural processed coffees. So there were a lot of things that were present in this cup that really did kind of muddle the clarity within it. But in addition to that, there was a contrasting brightness at the forefront. And that's what I was mentioning when it came to the roast profile, because that really did seem to kind of contrast the really strong, robust, heavy characteristics to the cup. And there's this interesting middle point where right after you drink the coffee, it has that very robust, heavy characteristic, but then there's that brightness, and you can taste the brightness for a couple of seconds. And that's where I picked out a lot of these notes, because that's that kind of middle ground before the cup then finishes out very heavy and a very long-lasting heavy at that. So in that time, I was able to pick out something that, while they list it as peach, I would say you can see it as stone fruit. I wouldn't necessarily identify it as peach, as I oftentimes like to describe peach as being more fresh fruit. And in this case, it was a lot more jammy for me. So that's why I said a slightly more jammy stone fruit. And it did feel a little bit more in line with me in a unripened pineapple, or even a slightly more tart berry sense. And that's not too surprising. When it comes to these coffees, I often describe them as, well, very heavy berry coffees in general. This one, while not necessarily overly heavy on the berry side of things, was very heavy on the chocolate and kind of fermenty side of things. So that's what I was able to pick out. That small window, it did give me the notes that they had listed on there in slight manner. But other than that, yeah, this coffee was very reminiscent of my experiences with natural processed coffees. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we were getting. Right, 2 level 5s, so let's go through those real quick. We will start with the finish at a level 5. Yes, and this is why I haven't put many, if any, coffees in this advent calendar at the level 5, because this is the type of coffee that I'm reserving this for. This is that type of coffee where after you're tasting it, you are tasting it for a very long time. After that sip, I'm going to be tasting it long after this video has ended, because it does have so many of those really strong chocolate characteristics in that slightly fermenty sense. So as a result, I'm going to keep tasting this coffee, and that's why it scores that level 5. Chocolate level 5. Yes, as I mentioned, it often reminds me of like a stout beer, a very heavy stout beer, and as a result, it has that very lingering, long-lasting chocolate finish to the cup. So those two things go in line with each other. I'm going to be tasting this chocolate for a very long time. All right, a couple of level 4s. We'll start with the sweetness level 4. This is where the level 4 sweetness is something that I don't necessarily like, because it is sweet in a chocolate sense, but it's also sweet in a heavier, overbearing sense. So it's not the type of sweetness I enjoy. And while I often say I want a coffee to at least reach that level 4 mark, it's not necessarily a good thing if it's not the type of sweetness that I enjoy personally. But yes, it has a very chocolate sweet aspect to the cup. Acidity level 4. That's one thing I mentioned pretty early on, is that it does have that contrasting brightness to the really heavy, robust characteristics within this cup. So that right there is at the level 4 mark. And again, it does kind of indicate that there isn't too much development in this cup, even if it does have some of the more slightly developed qualities to it. Body level 4, yes, definitely lower in the Chemex. Truth be told, not too many differences within the Chemex. This is typically the one that I discuss the most when it comes to differences between the two brew methods. But this one had a little bit more body than a lot of the other cups in this advent calendar to this point. So fair bit of body to the cup, not too much to elaborate on that. And then we have a bunch of level 3s. There's a lot in this coffee, and I think that's why the clarity is as low as it is, but we'll get to the clarity later. Spice level 3, saltiness level 3. Yeah, I don't think I have too much to say on those. I think it's when I was analyzing this coffee and really thinking about it, I could taste it at one point or another enough to kind of justify a middle level in this tasting wheel. We'll discuss the fruits though. Berry fruit, as I kind of mentioned, when it comes to these natural processed Central and South American coffees, they often come out very berry-like to me. And I mentioned this is a little bit more of a tart berry, so I could see something like a raspberry in this. And that's why it's there. I also mentioned the citrus fruit because in that middle ground where there's that brightness, I think you could identify it as either that tart berry, you could identify it as that unripened pineapple because there is a slight bitterness to it. That's why the bitterness is there at that level 3, and that's why I put the citrus there at that level 3. But it was a lot more in line with a sweeter citric component as opposed to a more tart citric component. And then the stone fruit at level 3, also mentioned that that came out a little bit more jammy than fresh fruit for me. So I don't necessarily see the peach. I couldn't pull out peach from this coffee. I also couldn't pull out floral, which is another flavor note that they had listed out here. Honestly, I just pulled out so much of the chocolate, but the stone fruit, yeah, they're at that level 3 too. The caramel, I'll discuss real brief because there is a kind of brown candy component to this coffee, and that was maybe my favorite part of this coffee. And that's something I experienced with a lot of Langøra's coffees as well. So that's one of the things I wanted to highlight as one of the better parts of this coffee for me. And then the bitterness, savoriness, level 3. Yeah, I don't need to touch on those too much as I really want to focus on the most important thing, which is that cleanliness at the level 1 mark. And that's always going to be a negative for me when it comes to coffee. I want my clarity minimum, very bare minimum as a level 3, but I prefer minimum to be a level 4. So yeah, being at that level 1 mark, it had all of the aspects that kind of muddles that clarity. So it had the fermentiness, it had the graininess, and it had that slight savory olive-like aspect to it. So I couldn't score that above level 1. That's not uncommon. That's been very typical for a lot of these natural processed Central and South American coffees, especially the more heavier processed versions of these coffees. And I've had some natural processed coffees from African origins as well that fall into this one category. So it's pretty common, unfortunately. So yeah, this tasting wheel is basically in line with both brew methods. I don't really have too much else to say about it in terms of the Chemex. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. I mean, I went into it knowing that this wasn't my type of coffee. I was very unlikely to actually enjoy this coffee, and that turned out to be the case. There were some positives that I took away from it. I was able to experience maybe a little bit more from this coffee than I typically experience with a lot of these coffees in general. However, the heavy overbearing aspect in the coffee was definitely present, and that right there is always going to hinder just how much I enjoy this type of coffee. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to, pretty straightforward. You like your heavier processed coffees. If you've really enjoyed the more robust chocolate characteristics to it, this one's obviously going to be another nice fit for you. However, in line with that, you are also able to experience some contrasting characteristics to it because it did have some interesting middle ground fruits to it that did go somewhat against the really strong, heavier aspects of this coffee. And I think for that reason, it gave it a little bit more complexity than I typically experience with these sorts of coffees in general. So there are some really nice positives to this one as well, even if they aren't necessarily for me. I think for the most part, I'll leave this review at that. If you've by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, we'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you enjoyed the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the El Durazno, natural processed Guatemala from Langøra Kaffe. Thank you for watching.